If you're watching this, this is Training Think Tank's Loaded Stretching and End Range Isometric playlist. These tools are two that we use to teach and prescribe movement. Most people know what stretching is, but similarly, most people know what running is. And if I said, hey, can you run? Most people would say yes. But there's an entire field that educates people on the nuance of running, dedicated to sprint running, slow running, running in field sports, change of direction running, barefoot running. And there are so many rabbit holes you can go down with something that seems simple. So similarly with stretching, it is just getting into the end range of a joint and putting pressure on it to elongate the tissue. But there is a lot more nuance that goes into properly creating deeper end ranges that then translate into being a better mover, however you define that. So this training category is loaded stretching, which I'll cover, and it's also end range isometrics. I have a principle that I teach when it comes to movement that anytime you open up a range of motion, you should also strengthen it. So the end range isometrics become contractions that you do on the backside of any stretching. And this is to interact with what is called the stretch reflex. And the stretch reflex is basically a contraction that happens in response to a joint being taken past your nervous system's comfort with that range. So when we stretch a muscle, oftentimes the reaction we get will pull the muscle belly back into a shorter range. And I've heard people say oftentimes in my career that I don't stretch because it makes me tighter. And I think this is one of the major reasons why. So we put isometrics into this training category at the end of stretching to ensure that you can strengthen and control the range of motion after any time that you open it up. So I'm going to go into some execution tips and why you would use this in your training in this video. Having more freedom to move shouldn't be something that I have to convince you to do in your training. And I know, at least I think that it comes from, or the resistance to stretching comes from some select research studies that say stretching makes you weaker. I know for myself, empirically, if I got too tight in specific areas, I get weaker. So there is probably some sort of a spectrum that if you get too tight and you aren't able to contract properly, you get weaker. And then if you spend way too much time stretching and not reinforcing your end ranges, you get weaker. But it's probably some sort of an inverted U that as you get better ranges of motion and are better able to contract, I'm just going to redo that. I don't know why I went into the inverted U shit. Huh?
Never mind. Go ahead.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say it sounded fine to me.
Okay. Having freedom to move shouldn't be something that I have to convince you of in training. I think the resistance to the idea of stretching comes from some select research studies that state if you stretch, you lose power output. There is probably some truth to this, that if you stretch for a really long period of times right before trying to do max effort plyometrics or max effort lifting, you will lower your power output. But I know empirically for myself with my own training and with other athletes that if I get too tight in specific areas, I'll also get weaker. So there's probably some sort of a gradient where if I'm on too far of the tightness spectrum, I don't get into proper positions to be powerful and explosive. And then if I'm too far on the loose and stretched side of the spectrum, I can't generate the requisite tension I need to be explosive. So I found that stretching and the amount of stretching that you do is context related relative to the goals that you have in training. If you want to be super pliable and create really elaborate positions with your body, you'll probably need to stretch and you might be a little bit less explosive. If you just want to Olympic lift and potentially pick a couple patterns to be really explosive in, then you might just stretch the areas of the body that you need optimal force production in to be explosive in those patterns. And that's something you got to go through with your coach specifically. But in order to illustrate why you would stretch or why you would use some of the training videos in this category and why you would go through some end range isometric protocols, I wanted to bring up a few examples to illustrate this. So let's just say you wanted to get better at handstand walking, but every time you kick up, you practice and your wrists start to get really sore. And you try to just build volume and try to kick yourself up into handstands. You watch some YouTube videos where people say get into pike handstand holds on a box and then progress by picking one leg up and then use the wall and then go wall facing and work on your body line. But nothing you do and none of the progressions that they say to do over the course of whatever, 4, 6, 8 weeks are working because you can't get over the discomfort. So this would be a good time to step back away from the intensity, step back away from inverting and putting your whole body weight on top of a relatively small joint, and focus on opening up more range to have active wrist extension capabilities, and then slowly load that after you open the range up and get more comfort in that specific joint. So as an example, if I said, I'm going to stretch this area. I mean, I'd probably use the floor, but to illustrate it, if I were going to stretch into wrist extension here, I'd hold the stretch for a period of time, and where the end range isometrics come in is this is my end range. As I push in, that's my end range. If I'm going to do isometrics in this position, then that means there's basically two sides of the joint that I can contract on. Typically, what people will do is they'll contract towards the stretch. So all of this tissue has become elongated, and then when I pulse against it, if I pull with my fingers or pull with my hand, I'm using all of this elongated tissue to try to contract against the stretch. So I'm basically doing strength work in these elongated tissues. So that would be one direction of the isometric that I can go. The other direction would be contracting all of this shortened tissue over here to get strength on the opposite side of the stretch. So the isometrics would be I stretch for a period of time and then I press into the stretch, and then after a period of time I would contract with the stretch. Now, if I'm at end range and I'm trying to contract this way, I'm not actually going to be able to move my fingers because then it wouldn't actually be my end range. If I were here and then I was stretching and I pulled my fingers off, now I reestablish a new end range, and that's where I should be doing my end range isometric. So that's the loaded stretching and end range isometric. That's what the end range isometric does after the stretch. So anytime I stretch, I'm strengthening the range of motion with those end range isometrics. So let's take a second example to illustrate why you would use this. Say you wanted to improve your snatch. Things you've tried, you found a one-on-one weightlifting coach and got some technical coaching. You've done some long duration banded stretching on your ankles, your knees, and your hips. But as you stretch and open up the ranges, you find yourself sensing a bit more pain. You find that you're loose in the bottom and you're feeling a little bit more unstable as your ranges open up. So this is where some loaded stretching protocols followed by end range isometrics could potentially be something that would benefit you in your training. Think of what you're doing here. Instead of me teaching you how to do something different, if you have been doing banded stretching, then this is just stretching. It's just a different format of doing it that could potentially stabilize the ranges that you're opening up in a way that then it translates to snatching. So it's the same thing you're doing from, in a yoga class, or the same thing you were doing in physical education class when you're young, but instead you're just trying to take a more systematic approach to doing it so that you're not creating laxity in any joints that you need stability in for whatever your training goals are. So if you are one of those people that's using a bunch of stretching to try to translate into a fast, ballistic, high power movement, and you find that it's not actually making you better, this would be a time that regressing doing some stretching, following it up with some really aggressive isometric protocols afterwards to reinforce those new ranges could translate into more effectively doing, the snatch in this example. So if you find that there's a joint that's holding you back from a specific movement, targeting that joint, doing some loaded stretching or just stretching with your own body weight, and then doing some isometrics following it could be a really effective way of improving your movement quality. I've already gave you some brief insight into how to perform these, but on top of what I just explained, I want to give you some execution tips moving forward so that you can have a long-term and sustainable movement practice that allows you to get better over time. So, some things to focus on. The first, focus on your breath. If you're in aggressively deep positions of stretching, some positions you're going to be in, you're going to have a shallower breath cadence. Some position you'll be able to breathe deeply. Some positions will compress your rib cage into your pelvic girdle and you'll not be able to take an appropriate diaphragmatic breath and you might need to resort to some chest breathing. But regardless of where the breath is coming from, I think having an awareness of your breath and making sure that you're not holding your breath is something that's vital to be able to stretch long term. If you're not breathing in a position, it is unsustainable, period. You're going to have dysregulated breathing, you're going to accumulate CO2, you're going to create blood chemistry changes, and that is not a sustainable way to move. And if that's the case, you don't want to be in a position for long periods of time where you're bracing and not able to breathe. So focus on your breath and being aware. If you get into a position that you have to hold your breath in, that's okay. Just don't hold it for a really long period of time. Back away from it and breathe. And make sure that you're continuing to breathe and continuing to focus on your breathe as you're establishing new end range positions. The second cue would be to flirt with your end ranges. I hate to publicly admit this, but I've actually forced myself into deep end range positions while trying to build middle splits where I've actually partially tore my adductor. So I know what it's like to really want to be able to cultivate a position that you don't yet have. But if you do that, then you're going to create scar tissue, tightness, adhesions, and also some fear when you're trying to reestablish that range over time, which therefore makes trying to open up ranges a much more difficult, time-consuming process. So instead of being stubborn and feeling the tension at your end range and being like, oh, I can go through this, instead, back yourself down and just get to the point of discomfort. Hold that, breathe in that position, and then slowly over time try to establish a deeper and deeper range. Over time and being consistent and persistent with your stretching practice or your movement practice in general is the thing that opens up your body. It's not something that you can be super intense on with for 2 weeks and expect to have these dramatic and massive changes in ranges of motion that stay there, that are strong, that are reinforced, and that are capable of doing things fast, explosively, and just having that freedom. So instead of trying to do that, be patient and just flirt with the end ranges and make sure that you think more about consistency over time than intensity per session. Third cue, as a starting point, our movement course covers this pretty extensively, and when we write programs for people, we'll progress them over time in terms of time of the stretch, time of the contraction, intensity of the contraction. But for this video, instead just start with a 2-minute stretch and then 3 sets of 10-second isometric contractions in both directions. So again, to take the wrist example, if I were stretching here, I'd get to the end range or flirt with my end range, hold it for 2 minutes, back out of the stretch, go back to that end range and hold the isometric here on the short side for 10 seconds, then relax, then get back into the stretch, push in that direction for 10 seconds, repeat that 3 times in both directions, and that would be a starting point for you to work with. As you go forward, you can add time to the stretch, You can add load to the stretch. You could add pressure with your own body weight. You could add time with the isometric contractions, and you can do a bunch of creative stuff to create a progression over time the same way you would with strength training or energy system training or any types of training that you would do to progressively get better over time. Fourth thing to focus on, get comfortable with cramping. Rod McKinnon is a Nobel Prize winning scientist that kind of came up with the evidence to support that cramping is more of a neurological issue than some of the other stuff that goes on, like dehydration and some of the other reasons why people say that we cramp. And what I found over time is that when people are trying to establish new end ranges and they're doing these isometrics, they'll get a ton of cramping sensations, especially in the shortened ranges. So if I'm here and I'm doing contractions on this side, usually in the hips, in the deep hip flexor muscles, if somebody's doing pike stretches and then they're trying to lift up their leg, their quads and their hip flexors will like really start to bundle up and cramp. And a lot of people are really averse to that cramping sensation, and they'll be like, oh my God, I'm cramping, and then they'll stop because they're fearful of that. What I've found over time is if you want to establish new end ranges, you have to get a little bit more comfortable with that. Now, I'm not saying to sit there and force your muscle belly to cramp at max effort, but if you feel the cramp, slowly back away from it, slowly back away from the contraction, and try to get a little bit more comfortable with that like really aggressive impulse signal that you're getting from your muscle when it's cramping, because it's going to happen if you're trying to cultivate new end ranges. Similarly, if you're like exercising really hard and you're taking a muscle to failure, you get that muscle pump and people get comfortable with that pump, and over time I think they just start to feel comfortable with it. I've found with movement training and developing deeper end ranges, the cramping sensation is something that you just have to cope with over time, and you get more and more comfortable being able to contract it in your end range as you get more comfortable with it. The fifth thing, be patient and consistent. I kind of already articulated that a little bit with regards to the flirt with your end range, but just make sure that you realize that doing this over time is the thing that's going to make you successful. It's not just, watching this video, getting really fired up about stretching and doing it for the next 3 or 4 weeks. It's not going to really make the difference that you need. You need to be thinking of this as a month, year, multi-year long project. And the sixth thing, keep tension in your body that you don't want motion to come from. So as an example, if you're trying to improve your toes to bar and you want to make sure that you get into hip flexion without your lower back and lumbar spine rounding a lot, because let's say it's paired with heavy deadlifts and you don't want your back deeply getting into flexion as you're pulling a heavy bar because that's unsafe, then when you're doing your pike stretches, make sure that you have tension in your midline and you're not softening and rounding just to create a compression. And instead, you're staying tight through the midline and forcing the tension specifically on your hip flexion. That is something that you have to cultivate over time, and you have to become really aware of the musculature in your core or in, surrounding the joints that you're stretching, and you might have to get some external eyes on you. But as a rule of thumb, any area that you don't want moving when you're doing a stretch, just keep it a little bit tighter than the areas that you're trying to relax and actually stretch and create end range. So if you follow those 6 cues, those 6 execution tips, you should effectively be able to create movement change over time. What you'll see in the videos in this playlist are me getting into various stretch positions and holding them. The isometrics are obviously difficult to illustrate in a video because you don't move. So you're just basically contracting in those end range positions. The positions I chose to illustrate in this playlist are focused on joints, and the joints would be joints that you would find useful to open up ranges for specific movement tasks that you have in your training goals. So as an example, if you want to improve your chest to bars and you find that when you go down on the pull-up bar and you try to get your arms farther behind you and that's a limitation for you in a position that you need to open up, then the shoulder stretches with your arms overhead would be more effective stretches and loaded end range positions for you to target than, somebody else that needs to improve their lower leg mobility so that they can bound and run more effectively. So Figure out what you need to open up, figure out what joints you need to strengthen, and then pick those specific stretches. I illustrated, a number of them, but there's an infinite number of positions that you can cultivate. So figure out from that index that I created what's most effective for you, then watch that video and start with mimicking those, and then over time be creative and come up with your own solutions and own positions to stretch, and then do the isometrics in those positions. And that should be an effective way for you to get better. Like is true for all the movement playlists on our YouTube channel. This is one of many that acts as a part of a bigger whole. So to improve your movement quality, you need to go through all of the movement tools playlists and think of them as acting synergistically with one another to, over time, be able to improve your movement quality. For anyone that's taken the movement course, Chapter 3 covers movement tools, and in the movement tools, we cover all of these more extensively. I cover where the inspiration for each category comes from, how to write training prescriptions with each tool, how to progress the training tools, what each specific movement tool is used for, and you've seen sample programs that utilize all of these over the course of 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks. And so you'll have a much better understanding of how to think about this in terms of long-term progress. As you go forward now, you have everything that you need to get better. You have every tool from a movement perspective that we could think of. You understand how to use them, you understand why to use them, and you have a bunch of videos in each playlist that illustrate the actual use of those movement tools. So good luck, and hopefully your movement quality gets better.